We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our three biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. I'm your host for today's episode, Sean Blackburn with Sweetfish Media. I'm joined today by Matt Burns. He is the founder of the Global HR Collective. Matt, how are you doing today?
I am doing really well, Sean. Yourself?
Doing fantastic. It's great to have you on the show. Today, we're going to be unpacking marketing and HR reunited at last. But before we begin, if you could just give our audience a little bit of background about yourself and what it is you guys are up to over at the Global HR Collective.
Yeah, happy to. So, about me, I spent 20 years in the corporate world, 15 of them in human resources, and the last 5 to 7 of them as an HR executive. I found myself, Sean, architecting and implementing a lot of large restructuring activities, which is really fancy HR lingo for job loss. And I got to a place in my career where I was asking myself, do I want to spend the next 20 years of my career helping people lose their jobs? And the answer I came up with was no. And that combined with the experience I had during my MBA led me to decide that I wanted to really leverage the skills and the gifts that I had externally and help people more broadly in society. So we launched the Global HR Collective last fall. Our mission's pretty straightforward. We're going to raise $1 million for charity in the next 5 years to support mental health advocacy and women entrepreneurs. And we do that 3 ways. The first way is we're starting out with consulting services, again, leveraging the experience that I've developed over the course of those 20 years in the corporate world. And mostly HR technology, helping connect technology into HR departments, helping connect analytics into HR departments, really trying to blend that qualitative and quantitative and help those departments have success going forward as they try and navigate the turbulent waters of the fourth industrial revolution. Do a bit of speaking and then as well, do a bit of coaching on the side as well.
Love that. So today we're talking about marketing and HR, connecting those two things and uniting those mission statements. What are some of those complementary skills that you see between those two disciplines?
Yeah, it's funny. I've mentioned this a few times and people at first give me this odd look. And then when I start to break it down, I think it becomes more clear. I actually think the function should be blended. And here's why. In the new HR leader of, if you will, the 21st century, there's a couple things that I look for when I'm looking for talent and things that I think the market and that means organizations will value. The first one is that blending of qualitative and quantitative decision making. These are skills that marketers have developed over decades. HR has been slow to come to the party, but we're increasingly moving down that path. I think an emphasis on experience as well. Again, marketing's been talking about the consumer experience for quite some time. And now you see in HR circles discussions around the employee experience, very much kind of curating a really great kind of end-to-end experience for that individual. The third one is the segmentation of audience and then delivering customized, tailored, curated messages to each. Again, there isn't a marketer on the planet who would send out an email blast and think their job is done. But HR for the last 100 years has been sending out the company emails and putting up things on bulletin boards. That is now starting to change as well as we try and find unique ways to engage an audience, which is very multi-generational and has different needs. The last piece I would say, well, actually, there's 2 last pieces. The first one, it was storytelling. Again, if you want to cut through the noise, both internally and externally, the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to tell really compelling stories. Mm-hmm. And we're learning that skill in HR, whether it's in an employment branding context, whether it's in an employee engagement context. The ability to cut through all that noise is critical. And I think the last and probably the most important piece is that in both functions, you have to influence an action without any direct authority. So in the context of marketing, you're working with a consumer that has no obligation to engage in your product or purchase your product or service.
Right.
There's no obligation at all. You have to create compelling messaging and copy and find the right timing and the right medium to compel that action. HR is exactly the same way. As a CHRO, my job was to move the organization's cultural mandate forward. And I did not have the ability to walk around the company with a stick saying thou shalt, because that's not the function of human resources. But the accountability to achieve a result is very similar to marketing in that I'm held accountable to achieving an outcome that the company thinks is appropriate.
Wow, that's fantastic. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but it's really about providing value in each discipline, one to,
Absolutely.
externally on marketing, but internally on the HR side. Do you see that being a common issue for a lot of HR departments, that they just have not reached that level of sophistication? Or is it something that you think is really starting to become a trend within the HR community?
To answer your question, I think quite simply, the answer is yes and yes. So traditionally, the HR profession has been cast in more of an administrative role. We were responsible for being custodians of the organization. We were responsible for transactional tasks like payroll and employee files and hiring. And that's where the predominant skill sets of the profession were. And therefore, the type of professional who populates that group tends to not have a very, if you will, a marketing cap on. So
Right.
they don't think about things externally. They're looking very inwardly. And I use the analogy of offense versus defense. To me, marketing is playing offense. You're thinking about externally and trying to expand and trying to grow. HR has traditionally been very defensive oriented. How do we protect? How do we mitigate risk? So that inherent kind of yin and yang doesn't allow itself to a marketing conversation. So I think part of it is the type of people drawn to the profession just simply aren't the right kind of people in the context of 21st century HR as it evolves, which is, by the way, happening in a lot of professions going forward. So I think that's part of the conversation. I think the other part of it is that we are having a greater appreciation of the employees' needs are changing. So in a typical patriarchal organization that was very top down and information was commoditized, you would disseminate information through the organization from the top. And when you thought that the employees needed to know something, you would tell them. And if you didn't, you didn't tell them. And that was completely acceptable up until about 10, 15 years ago. Now, with, of course, the millennial generation always having access to information at their fingertips, there's a greater expectation around transparency and democratization of knowledge. So the expectations are changing, and HR, as a function of that, needs to evolve to meet the employees' needs. So you have to connect with employees in a way that makes sense for them. I'll give you an example. My very first job, like a lot of people, was at McDonald's. When I used to spend my breaks, I would go into the lunchroom, I would grab the employee magazine, and I would thumb through it because that's all there was to do in my break. I didn't have a smartphone, right? I didn't this is 25 years ago. There was no smartphones. Like I had the magazine or I got to stare at the wall. So now I go into those same lunchrooms and everybody's on their phone. And you're competing with attention with the world. And I promise you, there's a million things on my phone that are more interesting than an employee handbook or an employee newsletter. So how do you communicate in a way that's compelling and drive engagement with an audience in the same way you would do so as a marketer? So you have to think about, if you're competing for attention internally, other than compelling people to stare at a computer screen while you flash memos in front of them, which is not reality, how do you get them interested in what you're doing, organization's mission, vision, values, strategy? You do so by developing and curating and disseminating really cool, interesting, unique content. And the days of just being able to staple up a bulletin board memo are over. You have to be on mobile. You have to blend multiple forms of media. I'm very bullish, by the way, on internal podcasts as a mechanism of disseminating information in a way that you can listen to it on the train into work. You can listen to it in a video format or an audio format or a text format. So kind of meet the audience, if you will, where they're at. We've never viewed in HR the employee as the audience. They've just simply been a step in the process. We're now changing that.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's something that I think a lot of organizations could really use a lot of growth in. So that is awesome that you guys are tackling that at the Global HR Collective. And man, our society is going through so much change, and us as marketers many times have adjusted to that. But I think that it's a fascinating subject to think about it from the internal side. What are some of the reasons why the alignment of internal and external messages are so critical?
Well, I think a couple of things. So we mentioned it before, but expectations for both the consumer and the employee are changing of organizations. So it's no longer good enough just to show up with a product and service and say, buy it. That's not good enough anymore. People
Right.
are making decisions increasingly based on their values, based on their alignment to the organization and its values. So what happens in a lot of cases, whether it's conscious or subconsciously, if you see two different messages, let's say you see marketing copy for a company that's misaligned with the employment culture, most people think one of two things. Either A, there's a really poor alignment of the external voice and the internal voice. So either two departments aren't coordinating. And I ask myself, can they actually handle my problem if two people inside of a company that are incentivized to collaborate don't?
Right.
And more negatively, if they're not aligned, someone's not telling the truth. Or maybe both aren't telling the truth. And if I'm a consumer and you tell me your company is an employee-driven culture, and then I read newspaper stories about how you treat your employees poorly, then I know that you're not being authentic. And that it's not matching. Your words aren't matching your actions. And then I ask myself, do I want to make an investment in you as a brand if you are not being genuine, and if you're not being authentic, and if your actions aren't matching your words? And that happens a lot of the time. It's why people are making decisions on who they buy for, and there's boycotts, things of that nature. It's often as a result of a misalignment of values or misalignment of the internal voice versus the external voice. So we work really hard with companies to make sure there is that alignment, so that don't say things you can't follow through with.
Right.
And in a lot of cases, it really comes down to, don't sell a vision of your organization that is not reality, because people will find out. There's just simply too many vehicles, whether it's employee driven, whether it's consumer driven, for individuals to figure out Glassdoor, even like Yelp. I mean, the whole internal, external thing, people will find out what's happening in organizations. So you're incentivized and you're encouraged to be as aligned and as genuine and authentic as possible.
And that is fascinating. Yeah, I've experienced that personally, actually, in out of alignment of internal and external messaging. And you're right, in the 21st century, it is just not acceptable anymore. It's not going to work. What are some of the ways that you practically get those departments to talk to each other and get the organization to align?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think where I start with is you look for common shared values and purpose. And boil down and strip away all the internal company politics and the struggle and the fight, if you will, for resources.
Right.
It really comes down to both functions should be focused in on helping the organization have success, and helping the consumer have success, and helping the employee have success. That should be the aligned shared goals. And it requires people to step outside of their individual corporate function and look at things more broadly. So we start with where is their alignment? And if the alignment is we're driving top line revenue and trying to satisfy customers and satisfy our employees, that's something we can all get on board with. So how do we each do that in a way that makes sense and supports the other functions in achieving their goals as well? Really, really basic conversation. But in a lot of companies, that's not happening. Other than that, the C-suite level, and that's not where most of the work is happening. That's where the strategy is happening. But when it comes time to actually develop copy or put out content or develop communications, that's happening generally 2 or 3 rungs below that C-suite level. And there simply isn't the coordination in a lot of organizations at that level where it's happening. So we try and encourage that alignment, and then try and create opportunities and environments for those two functions to connect in a real meaningful way so that they are aligned around messages. And then we develop a mechanism that, because there will be opportunities where you have to choose and you have to make it an either or decision. We try and avoid them, but it is reality in some companies. We develop a mechanism on how do you resolve questions like that when there seemingly is a misalignment. How do you get past that collectively? And how do you reinforce a relationship where you essentially look for collaboration first before you move forward with a message?
I love that. You mentioned the C-suite executives level getting involved. What's some of the important things that you see here in the 21st century in terms of the importance for personal branding on the C-suite executive level?
Yeah, I think it's critical. And I'm biased. I started this journey myself when I was in my last corporate role about 18 months before I left. So I think I'll break it into 2 parts. Let's first focus on the benefits to the organization. So for those C-suite executives in any role, whether you are in a CMO role, a CHRO role, a CEO role, CIO, pick your C-suite function. There's a huge benefit to the organization because, as we mentioned before, it's relatability. Brands are now more than products and services and logos. They're people. And if I know the people behind the brand and the logo and the product and the service, I'm either more inclined or less inclined to engage in that organization. And we're almost going back in time a little bit. So, flashback 100 years ago, you knew the shopkeeper of the store you'd go into. You developed a relationship with that individual. You want to see them have success, and they wanted to see you have success. We're getting back to that place, although it's at a much more macro level now with technology. So I think from an organizational perspective, by increasing the relatability of the brand, you actually can have a very dramatic effect on things like top line revenue, awareness in the market, employment branding. So there's huge advantages to executives in putting forward a more authentic view of themselves. But here's the challenge. A lot of executives, and I myself in the same situation, we're taught to not do that. So we are taught to keep everything very, very vanilla, very political. You answer questions in a very generic fashion so as to not seem controversial, because you're concerned about the consequences in this era where things can be misinterpreted and blown out of proportion. So you are very guarded in your answers. And I ultimately think that does the company a disservice. I think people actually want to see that authenticity. And I believe you can strike a balance between being very direct and open and being very respectful at the same time. From a personal perspective, I think it's absolutely critical for that leader to develop their personal brand, because ultimately each of us are managing our own careers and we're managing our own destiny in terms of our own development paths, if you will. And if you have any aspirations in the future, professionally or personally, they're all enhanced by a personal brand. If you want to start a new job, that will be enhanced by increasing your personal brand as a means of raising awareness in the market about what you have to offer. I get more job offers now that I'm an entrepreneur than I ever did as an executive, because people know who I am and they see what I produce in terms of content, and they reach out to me with job offers, unsolicited, and frankly with like, here's a contract with money on it, which blows my mind. That you see my content and then want to pay me without an interview. But it happens, I would say, once a week.
Wow.
Secondly is, if you want to develop a side business or a side hustle, if you will, if you want to be in coaching or consulting, or you want to volunteer on the side, all those things, again, are enhanced by developing a personal brand. Because once you telegraph your intentions in the market and the value that you provide in the market and who you are as a person, it connects people to you, and it's a means of developing business. So that's another important piece of it. If you want to write a book, same thing. If you're putting out a product or a service, write that book, develop that online course. That's all enhanced by a personal brand. So for me, it doesn't really matter the path that you want to go down. If you want to stay in your organization and you want to spend the next 20 years in this organization, it will be enhanced by you developing a personal brand, because it will provide incremental value to the organization. And you'll find yourself in conversations around upward mobility where delivering increased value that falls outside your core job responsibilities will only be seen as a positive thing in most organizations. And that's where, again, developing that personal brand becomes critical. For me, it was really a view of developing that plan B or that plan C. We're operating in an economy right now where, let's be honest, things happen, and people unfortunately do lose their jobs because of restructuring activities or because of massive transformations, or companies go through ebbs and flows. By developing that personal brand, you create opportunities to have options for yourself. And whether you exercise those options or not, it's your decision. But there's nothing more scary when you come out of a large organization and realize that you're just not connected to the market. And that's what I found when I started this journey. I just didn't know what was going on anymore. When you're in a big company, the only thing that matters is what happens in the four walls of that organization. And the reality is, there's a lot of other things happening in the market that you'll have to get up to in very quick order if you're going to compete for jobs, compete as an entrepreneur, or compete and put products and services in the market.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I think it really is a win-win for the company and for the individual. So I love that you guys are approaching it that way. What's one innovative idea that you're thinking about right now?
So I grew up in retail. So retail is, how I define it, is you're trying to convert $1 million ideas into $100 concepts. You don't have big budgets. You have very thin margins. Customer expectations are increasing in their demand, and you have to try and make sense of it. And HR, as a cost center in those organizations, often finds themselves having to do more with less. And I had a coach who once told me that constraints drive innovation. And that, for me, is something I've taken with me throughout my entire career, is that idea that just because you don't have a lot doesn't mean you can't be innovative. So I'm looking for opportunities in organizations now where we have an opportunity to help them increase value at a lower price point. And I'll give you one example that's kind of marketing, kind of HR. Most organizations have an employee intranet, a module where people can access information. It's a database of a repository of information. Maybe there's a collaboration tool. It's a place people can go to, a hub of information in an organization. If you strip away all the actual functions of an intranet, it really comes down to a few simple things. It's that information repository. It's a communication mechanism. It may have collaboration tools, and it is a query tool for people that want to find information about the company internally. You can accomplish those same goals with 3 tools. First is a podcast for the communication of information internally. And a podcast, again, allows you the ability to break content into video, audio, and text for the same piece of content. So you can engage people on multiple different mediums.
Right.
Secondly, it's an information repository, which if anyone's been on an intranet, trying to find things in the search menu of an intranet is in and of itself a whole different challenge.
Yes.
A chat bot can solve that for you. You can populate the most often asked questions about policies and benefits entitlements and company updates in a chat bot, and then people can pull the information on demand and save so much time having to go through that query tool.
Right.
And the third thing is it's a collaboration tool. So if you're going to use an instant messenger or a collaboration tool like Slack, you bolt those 3 things together, there's your intranet. By the way, those 3 things together are often half, if not less expensive than a traditional intranet in most organizations. There's a great example of providing that incremental value at a lower price point. It actually provides better service to the internal customer.
Absolutely. And especially, in terms of ease of use, that's going to be an end user experience from the employee level much better. So that's a fantastic idea. I love that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a function of marketing has been incentivized to innovate because it's a top line revenue generating function.
Right.
HR is a cost center, and therefore innovation is a lagging measure. And as a result of that, you just don't see the innovation and the ideas around that you would see from a marketing function. That is starting to change, though. So we're looking at the Global HR Collective for opportunities to save organizations money and at the same time provide an incremental value in terms of the employee experience inside of organizations. And it's possible. So it just requires a bit of innovative thinking, a bit of creativity around solutions. But I've found in most cases when we are involved in some sort of transformation, we can often self-fund it in the first year, which is absolutely crazy when you think about how much money companies are spending on things like employee engagement surveys and training and development and communication. A lot of that money is just being leaked out and it's not providing value. We can help them provide value for that and save money at the same time. And that's what gets me really excited because I get to solve complex problems with simple solutions and ultimately make the employee experience better for those companies.
It's fantastic. So if someone is in our audience now and they're on the HR side of things, what would be your encouragement for them, this week as they're going throughout their career and, this year in 2019 overall?
Yeah, I think first off is be open to different ways of thinking around this profession and around your organization. And I think more often than not, it's just a function of where are your current pain points in your department? And for most of HR functions, it's that manual administrative work. How do you find a way to automate that work using technology or using data? And then think about how you will reinvest the savings, both in time and money, into adding incremental value to your organization. So you can choose to deliver that savings back to the company in its bottom line and be a hero in HR that actually saves money for a company. Or you can reinvest those investments back into an employee experience or employee benefits, and then be a hero internally in terms of the company, in terms of providing a much better experience for those organizations and those people in them. So I think it's a function of determining where you have pain, developing innovative solutions around that, business cases, and then just making it happen. The last thing I would say is just start small. Like I've talked about some pretty big ideas around intranets, around cultural transformation, those things we provide value with, but there's no reason why you can't start really, really small and get to a level of basic automation or basic employment branding where you can just simply drive a ton of value and then build on the momentum of that.
I love that. So thanks, Matt, so much for this conversation. I love your perspective on uniting marketing and HR. If anybody has any questions or would like to follow up and connect with you, what's the best way for them to find you?
2 ways. I live on LinkedIn. So you can find me at Matt Burns. Just type in Matt D. Burns on LinkedIn or Matt Burns HR. You'll see my ugly mug on the site there. And then if you want to get a hold of me as well, you can email me at matt@globalhrcollective.org.
Fantastic. Well, Matt, thanks again for being on the show. I really appreciate your perspective and the challenges that you've laid out for our audience today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Digital marketing agencies have a tough job. You have to stay on top of the latest marketing strategies for your clients and your agency. What if there was a way you could address both at the same time? Imagine your agency putting out content with greater quality and quantity. Envision bringing your clients a turnkey solution for one of B2B marketing's fastest growing media strategies, podcasting. You know, all those clients asking for your help with their account-based marketing efforts? Picture being the first to bring them the idea of content-based networking, showing them the proven strategy for breaking into their most coveted accounts. Here's the concept. Sweetfish Media is looking to work with a limited number of innovative agencies interested in a new partnership model. We produce a podcast for your agency. You introduce the power of podcasting and Sweetfish services to your clients. Everybody wins. Learn more at sweetfishpartners.com.